You still have a choice. Leave now, or stay, and I will make your life a nightmare until you wish you hadn't. Sergeant Dylan Vischer stepped closer. His badge caught the morning sun as his eyes moved slowly across Grace Keener's house like he was already measuring it for demolition. His mouth curved into something that wasn't a smile, just enough to show he meant every word. Grace's hands were shaking. 6 weeks of invented violations. 6 weeks of this badge treating her childhood home like it was already gone. What Vischer didn't know was that across the street, a Navy SEAL had been recording every single word, and his K-9 had already decided this man was a threat. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The hose had been running for 4 minutes when the cruiser turned onto Camellia Drive. Grace Keener didn't look up right away. She knew the sound of that engine. She had learned it the hard way. The low, unhurried rumble of a car that wasn't in a hurry because it didn't need to be. She kept the water moving across her mother's flower beds, the stream steady in her hand, her eyes on the soil. 3rd time, she thought. 3rd time in 6 weeks. The morning was already thick with August heat, barely 6:45, and the air sat heavy and damp against her skin. The neighborhood was quiet. A few sprinklers ticking on nearby lawns, a dog barking somewhere 2 streets over. Camellia Drive looked exactly like it always had. Old oak trees lining the sidewalk, modest, well-kept houses, flower beds that people tended because they cared, not because anyone was watching. Her mother had planted these flowers. Her father had laid this walkway, 1 stone at a time, on a Saturday when Grace was 6 years old. She had handed him the stones from a bucket while he worked. She still remembered the weight of them in her small hands. She heard the car door. "Morning." Sergeant Dylan Vischer walked toward her the way he always did. Slow, easy, like a man who had nowhere to be and knew it. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with small eyes that moved over things in a way that made her feel like she was being appraised rather than looked at. His uniform was pressed. His badge caught the early sun. Grace turned off the hose. She did not smile. "Officer?" "Ms. Keener." He stopped at the edge of her front walk. "Got another concern to bring to your attention." "I'm sure you do." "That hose." He nodded toward it. "Crossing the public easement line again. Code violation." Grace looked at the hose. It lay flat against the grass, exactly where it always rested. She looked back at him. "That hose is 14 inches from the easement line," she said. Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the Municipal Code requires 6 inches minimum clearance. I looked it up. After your last visit. Something moved behind his eyes, cold and slow. "Move it, anyway." "And if I don't?" Vischer took a step forward, then another. He was close now. Too close. And his voice dropped into something low and deliberate. "Then I write it up. And once it goes in the system, I make a call. And that call turns into an inspection. And that inspection," he let the word hang, "turns into condemnation proceedings. You know how long that takes? 6 weeks. Maybe less for a house this old." His eyes drifted to the front door, the windows, the roof, moving across her home the way a wrecking ball moves before it swings. "You'd be out before Thanksgiving." Grace's breath caught. She held it. "You can't." "I already have. Twice. On this street." He leaned in slightly. "Nobody stopped me then. Nobody's stopping me now. You're what, 32? Widowed? Teaching 3rd grade?" His mouth curved into something that wasn't a smile. "Honey, you don't have the money, the time, or the connections to fight what's coming. Take the offer from Hargrove, pack your things, and move on. Or stay. And I will make your life a nightmare until you wish you hadn't." He was 6 inches from her face. Across the street, Conrad Clarkson had stopped walking the moment the cruiser door opened. He stood on the sidewalk with his K-9, Atlas, at his heel, watching. He had seen this before. Not on this street, Not in this neighborhood, but he had seen it. The particular way a man in uniform approached a woman alone, the angle of the body, the deliberate use of space, the badge doing the talking before the mouth even opened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His thumb found the camera. He opened it, switched to video, and pressed record. Steady, unhurried, the way he did everything. He held the phone at his side, angled upward, the lens pointed directly across the street. Whatever was about to happen, it was going on record. Atlas moved first. The big German shepherd had been sitting perfectly still, but now his ears snapped forward, his head dropped low, and a deep, continuous sound built in his chest. Not barking. Something older and more serious than barking. A warning that came from instinct, not training. Conrad glanced down at him. In 3 tours of service, he had learned one absolute truth about Atlas. The dog was never wrong. He looked back across the street. Vischer's body had shifted forward. Grace had gone completely still. The way people go still when they are calculating whether they are safe, when fight or flight are both running at the same time, and neither one has won yet. Conrad raised his phone, deliberate, fully visible, making sure the lens had a clean, unobstructed angle on both of them. Every word Vischer had just said was already on the recording. Every inch of that illegal proximity was already documented. He held the shot for 3 more seconds. Then he pocketed the phone and moved. He crossed the street in long, unhurried strides, Atlas matching him step for step. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He walked with the quiet certainty of a man who had put himself between danger and innocent people in places far worse than a suburban sidewalk. He stepped directly between Grace and Vischer. Not aggressively, not dramatically. He simply placed his body there, calm, immovable, a wall that had decided where it stood. Atlas sat at his heel and fixed his gaze on Vischer without blinking. Vischer stepped back. 1 step. Involuntary. Conrad looked at him with an expression that was not angry, not threatening, just completely, utterly serious. He said nothing for a moment. He let the silence do its work. Then, quietly, "I think you're done here." Vischer's jaw tightened. His eyes dropped briefly to Atlas, who had not moved, had not looked away, and showed absolutely no intention of doing either. Then back up to Conrad. Something shifted in Vischer's expression. The performance slipped, just for a second. And what was underneath it wasn't confidence. He straightened, adjusted his belt, looked past Conrad to Grace. "You think about what I said." He turned and walked back to his cruiser. Slow, deliberate, still trying to own the moment he had just lost. The door closed, the engine turned over. The cruiser rolled away. Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were shaking. She looked at the man standing beside her, this stranger who had just stepped into the middle of her life without being asked. Conrad turned to her. His expression was steady, even. "You all right?" She looked at him, then at Atlas, who had finally, only now, relaxed his gaze and settled back on his haunches. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. Conrad gave a single nod, like that was a fair answer. Then he reached into his pocket and held up his phone between them, the screen still showing the video timestamp, still running. "He won't know I have this," Conrad said quietly. "Not yet." Grace stared at the phone, then at him. For the first time in 6 weeks, the shaking in her hands began to slow. The school day was the longest one Grace could remember. She stood in front of 23 third graders and taught them about community. What it meant, why it mattered, how neighborhoods were built by people who decided to stay. She used her best teacher voice. Steady, warm, present. Inside, she was anything but. Vischer's words had followed her through every hour of the day, settling into her chest like something with weight. You don't have the money, the time, or the connections. She had replayed the scene 100 times between morning circle and afternoon dismissal. The way he had leaned in. The way his eyes had moved across her house, like he was already measuring it for something else. And then Conrad. The phone already raised, already recording, before he ever set foot on the street. She had seen the timestamp on that screen. He hadn't started recording when things got bad. He had started recording the moment Vischer got out of the car. That meant he had been watching before she even knew she needed a witness. She didn't know what to make of that. But she hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. She pulled into her driveway at 4:20 p.m. and sat in the car for a moment. He had shown her the phone that morning, the screen still running, the timestamp climbing, and said quietly, "He won't know I have this. Not yet." Then he had gone back across the street, and she had gone inside, and the day had swallowed her whole before she'd had a chance to breathe. She had his name. She had his words. She had the image of that timestamp burned behind her eyes. What she didn't have yet was the full picture. What exactly the recording had caught. How much of it was usable. Whether it was enough to mean anything at all against a man with a badge and apparent connections to people with money. She got out of the car and crossed the street before she talked herself out of it. Conrad opened the door on the second knock. He didn't look surprised. He stepped aside without ceremony, and Atlas moved back to make room, tail low and easy. "I want to see it," Grace said. "All of it. That's why I left the light on," he said simply. She followed him to the kitchen. A laptop sat open on the counter, already loaded. The video paused at the first frame. She could see herself on screen, standing in her front yard, hose in hand, Vischer's cruiser visible at the edge of the frame. Conrad hit play and said nothing. She watched in silence. Hearing it was different from living it. In the moment, her whole body had been occupied with holding herself together, keeping her voice level, keeping her feet planted, managing the fear that Vischer clearly intended for her to feel. She hadn't been able to fully absorb it while it was happening. Now she absorbed all of it. Every word. The condemnation threat. "You'd be out before Thanksgiving." The moment he leaned in, the particular, deliberate cruelty of Honey, "You don't have the money, the time, or the connections." Her own stillness on screen. She could see now what she had only felt then. The frozen quality of a person calculating whether they are safe. Then Conrad entering the frame. The way Vischer's body shifted back, just one step, just one, but unmistakable. A man who had been entirely comfortable, suddenly not. When it ended, she realized her arms were crossed tight against her chest. She uncrossed them deliberately. "That's all admissible?" she asked. "One-party consent state," Conrad said. "Everything on that recording is legal." She exhaled slowly. "How much of that is enough to—" "On its own?" He was honest about it. "Enough for a formal complaint. Not enough to guarantee anything happens to him." He turned to face her fully. "Has he done this before? To you? Specifically?" And so she told him. All of it. The 6 weeks of harassment. The 3 invented violations. The 2 neighbors who had already sold under pressure, including Miss Evelyn next door, who had lived on Camellia Drive longer than Grace had been alive. The rumor that Hargrove Development had a city official in their pocket. She told him about her parents building their lives in this house, about her father signing it over to her before the wedding. She told him about Jonas, briefly, just enough for Conrad to understand what this house was. Not property, not an asset, continuity, proof that her family was here, belonged here, and could not simply be erased. Conrad listened without interrupting once. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, filing a complaint tomorrow routes directly to Chief Herter. He'll warn Vischer by noon. 1 recording isn't enough to survive that. He looked at her steadily. But 1 recording is a start. We keep building. We. She noticed the word. So did something in her chest. A small, cautious thing that had been braced for "you're on your own" and got something entirely different instead. She stood to leave. At the door, she paused. "Why did you start recording before you even crossed the street?" she asked. "You didn't know what was going to happen." Conrad looked at her evenly. "I knew enough," he said. Grace nodded once and walked back across the street to her house. The evening air sat warm and still around her. She went inside and stood in her parents' kitchen for a long moment. For the first time in 6 weeks, the fear in her chest had something next to it. It felt a little like fighting back. Grace was back across the street by 7:15 Thursday morning. She had spent Wednesday night the same way she'd spent most nights lately, lying awake in the quiet house, staring at the ceiling, thinking. But this time, the thinking had a different quality to it. Less circular. More like planning. By the time the sun came up, she had a list of questions in her head, and no patience left for waiting. She knocked twice. Conrad opened the door already dressed, coffee in hand, Atlas at his side. He looked at her the way he always seemed to look at her, like her arrival was simply the next logical thing. "Come in," he said. They sat at his kitchen table, plain and functional, nothing on it except 2 mugs and the quiet between them. Grace wrapped both hands around her coffee and looked at him directly. "I need to understand the plan," she said. "Not the outline, the actual plan." Conrad nodded, like that was the right question to start with. He explained it simply. Vischer was not operating alone. That much was already clear from the Hargrove connection, which meant a single complaint against a single officer would get buried fast. Chief Herter would receive it, flag it for Vischer, and by the next morning there would be a counter-narrative ready. An accusation of misconduct against a police sergeant needed weight behind it. Multiple documented incidents, a visible pattern, evidence that could not be quietly set aside. "So we build the record first," Grace said. "We build the record first," Conrad confirmed. "You keep your routine exactly as it is. Nothing changes. You water the flowers, you go to work, you come home. Normal. I walk Atlas at 6 every morning and again in the evenings. Nobody thinks twice about a man walking his dog." He paused. "But I'm always watching." Grace was quiet for a moment. "How long?" "However long it takes him to show himself again." His voice was even. "Men like Vischer don't stop. That's the one thing working in our favor." She nodded slowly. Then she looked down at her mug, and something shifted in her expression. Something quieter and heavier moving up from beneath the practical conversation. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "About the house." "Go ahead." So she told him. She told him about her father, Drake, who had worked the same job for 26 years so that he could pay off the mortgage and have something real to hand down, who had signed the house over to her before her wedding because he wanted her to have something that was truly, legally, entirely hers. Something that couldn't be taken away by circumstance or bad luck or the wrong year. She told him about her mother's garden, the same flower beds Vischer had used as his excuse 3 times now, and how her mother had spent 20 years learning every plant by name. Then she told him about Jonas. Not much. Just enough. She told him that Jonas had stood on this porch the first time she brought him home, and looked at the street and said, "This is your armor, Grace. You understand that? This is the thing that holds you up." She told him that Jonas had been gone 18 months now, taken in a car accident on a Tuesday afternoon while she was teaching multiplication tables, and that she had learned to live with that the way you learn to live with any wound, carefully and with constant attention to where it hurt. She told him that Vischer knew she was a widow, had said it to her face, used it like a blade, widowed, teaching 3rd grade, like her losses were a list of weaknesses, like grief was the same thing as surrender. She stopped talking, looked out the window. "This house is the last place where all of them still exist," she said quietly. "My mother, my father, Jonas, all of it. If I lose it—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The kitchen was very still. Conrad looked at her for a moment. not with pity. Not with the careful, managed sympathy people usually offered when she mentioned Jonas. He looked at her the way someone looks at a thing they understand. "Then we don't lose it," he said. 3 words. No performance in them. Just a statement of fact. Grace pushed her chair back and stood. She had a classroom to get to. She picked up her bag, and at the kitchen doorway she paused and looked back at him. "What do you actually do?" she asked. "For work." "What is it you do?" Conrad considered the question for just a moment. "I used to do a lot of watching," he said. Grace held his gaze for a beat. Then she nodded once, walked down the hallway, and stepped out into the morning. For the first time in 6 weeks, something other than dread walked out of that house with her. Thursday morning, 6 a.m. sharp. Conrad came out of the front door with Atlas at his heel, the same as every morning. Same route, same pace. Same unremarkable man walking his dog while the neighborhood woke up around him. A few early risers had started to recognize Atlas. A woman on the corner always waved. A retired man 2 houses down had once offered the dog a biscuit. Conrad accepted all of it, warmly, unhurriedly, without leaving an impression worth remembering. That was exactly the point. He crossed toward the far side of Camellia Drive, letting Atlas set the pace. His phone was in his shirt pocket. The small lens of Atlas's collar camera pointed outward at the world. He wasn't thinking about what he might capture today. He was thinking about patterns. Vischer had come 3 times in 6 weeks. Men like Vischer were creatures of habit. They repeated what worked until something stopped them, which meant he would come back. And when he did, Conrad would be outside, and the camera would be running, and Vischer would have no idea. He just had to be patient. He didn't have to wait long. At 7:22 Thursday morning, on his second loop of the block, Conrad spotted Vischer's cruiser rolling slowly down Camellia Drive. No lights, no stop. Just that same slow, deliberate crawl. The roll of a man reminding the street that he could show up whenever he wanted. Conrad kept walking. He did not look directly at the cruiser. The car slowed further as it passed Grace's house. From the corner of his vision, Conrad watched Vischer raise his phone and point it through the window at the property, photographing the house, documenting it the way you documented something you were building a case against. Conrad walked Atlas another 30 feet down the sidewalk before smoothly turning back, unhurried. Just a man looping back on his route. The collar camera had a clean angle the entire time. He noted the timestamp in his head. 7:22 a.m., Thursday. 1 more brick in the wall. Friday brought the second piece. Conrad had noted the Hargrove development site trailer 2 blocks east on his morning walks, a portable office unit sitting at the edge of the cleared land, where 3 houses used to stand before their owners sold. He had been building a mental map of the people who moved in and out of it. On Friday afternoon, walking Atlas past the Walgreens on the main road, he spotted Vischer's personal vehicle, not the cruiser, his own gray pickup, parked near the far corner of the lot. Vischer was standing outside it, talking to a man in a white Hargrove Development polo shirt. They weren't loud. They weren't obvious. They looked, to anyone glancing over, like 2 people running into each other in a parking lot. Conrad walked Atlas to a bench near the store entrance and sat down. Normal. Unbothered. He scratched Atlas behind the ears, while the phone in his free hand recorded the exchange across the lot. The Hargrove rep pulled a folded document from a clipboard and handed it to Vischer. Vischer looked it over, nodded twice, and handed it back. They shook hands. Brief, businesslike. The handshake of 2 people who had done this before. The Hargrove rep returned to his truck. Conrad photographed the license plate before it left the lot. Saturday afternoon, Grace knocked on Miss Evelyn's door. She had been putting it off. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because Miss Evelyn, at 71, had already been through enough, had already lost the fight Grace was still in the middle of. And telling her the full truth felt like reopening something that had only barely closed. But she needed to know, and Miss Evelyn deserved to. She told her everything, sitting in Miss Evelyn's small living room, surrounded by 50 years of a life well lived. Miss Evelyn went very quiet as she listened. The kind of quiet that isn't emptiness, but wait. When Grace finished, Miss Evelyn looked at her hands in her lap. "He came to my door in October," she said softly, "stood right where you're sitting, and told me my fence was going to fail every inspection from here until I couldn't afford to fix it anymore." She paused. 2 days later, a man from Hargrove knocked and offered me assessed value. She looked up. I was scared. I was alone. And I signed. Her voice dropped to nearly nothing. I've regretted it every single day. Grace reached over and covered her hand. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Saturday evening, Conrad was waiting on Grace's porch when she got home. He held up his phone without preamble and played the Walgreens footage. Grace watched the exchange. Vischer, the polo shirt, the document, the handshake. And when it ended, she looked up slowly. "That man," she said, "the one from Hargrove." Her voice was steady, but tight. "He came to Miss Evelyn's door." Conrad nodded. "We have a pattern now," he said. 3 documented contacts, a direct coordination meeting, a clear connection between Vischer and Hargrove. He held her gaze. "But we need one more piece before this goes anywhere. Something that ties the whole thing together." Grace looked at her house. The flowers, the porch, the blue door. "Then we get it," she said. She went inside, sat at the kitchen table in the quiet, let herself think, carefully and without rushing, that this just might work. Sunday morning came in quietly. Grace was at the kitchen table with her coffee and a stack of lesson plans. The back door opened to let in what little breeze the morning offered. The house was peaceful in the way it only was on Sundays. No alarm, no rush, just the slow tick of the old clock in the hallway and the birds working the oak trees outside. Her phone rang at 8:14. She glanced at the screen. Her father. She picked up, smiling. "Hey, Dad." "Grace." His voice stopped her cold. Drake Keener had a voice built for reassurance. Deep, steady. The voice of a man who had talked her through every hard thing since she was old enough to have hard things. She had never once heard it sound the way it sounded right now. Tight, controlled, frightened underneath. "What happened?" she said. "I just got off the phone with the City of Maple Crest Code Enforcement Office." He paused, and she could hear him choosing his words carefully, the way he did when he was trying not to alarm her, while being unable to hide that something was very wrong. "They said a formal inspection request was filed on your property. Under my name, using my phone number." Another pause. "Grace, I didn't file anything. I never called anyone." "Someone used my information." She set down her coffee mug. "They scheduled it for next Monday," he said, "and they flagged it. They specifically flagged it as a potential condemnation assessment." The kitchen was very still. Condemnation. She knew what that word meant in plain language. She had been a homeowner long enough to know. Condemnation meant a city-appointed inspector walked through your home looking for violations. Enough violations, and the property went on an abatement list. And once it was on that list, she was already dialing Conrad before her father finished the sentence. He was at her door in 4 minutes. She let him in, and he sat down at the kitchen table with his laptop without being asked, already moving, already working the problem. Grace sat across from him and pulled up the city's code enforcement page on her own phone while she relayed everything her father had told her. Conrad typed the name of the assigned inspector. Then the firm, Crane and Associates, LLC. He found it in under 3 minutes. "Look at this," he said, and turned the laptop toward her. Crane and Associates was a private inspection firm operating under a city subcontract. Standard enough on the surface. But the firm's registered business address was a suite in the same building as Hargrove Development Group's regional office. 3 of Crane and Associates' last 5 municipal contracts had been awarded within 60 days of Hargrove breaking ground in the corresponding neighborhoods. The connection wasn't hidden. It just hadn't been looked for. If their inspector cites enough violations, Conrad said, his voice flat and precise, the city places the house on a municipal abatement list. From there, Hargrove submits an acquisition offer at assessed value, not market value, assessed. And the city— He stopped. Let her finish the thought. Forces the sale, she said. Forces the sale. Grace put the phone down on the table. She sat very still, looking at nothing, while the full shape of it settled over her. This wasn't Vischer showing up with invented code violations and intimidation tactics. That had been the warning shot, the pressure designed to make her sell willingly. This was what came next, when she didn't. This was the machinery behind the man. Built quietly, operated through paperwork and procedure and city contracts, dressed up in the language of municipal process so that by the time anyone understood what was happening, it would already be done. They had filed a complaint under her father's name. They had forged his information. They had used the identity of a 58-year-old man who had spent half his life paying off this house so that his daughter would always have somewhere safe to stand. She felt something move through her then. Not panic, not grief, something hotter than both. He knew, she said quietly. Vischer knew exactly what he was looking at when he came to this door. He wasn't guessing. He picked me because he thought I was easy. Young, widowed, a teacher's salary. She looked up. He had this planned before his first visit. Conrad said nothing. He didn't need to. The look on his face confirmed it. Drake's car pulled into the driveway at 6:30 that evening. Grace watched from the window as her father got out. He had a suitcase with him. He stood in the driveway for a moment and looked up at the house. This house, the one he had handed to her with both hands and a clear title. And something moved across his face that she had never seen there before. He stood there a long moment. Then his jaw set, and he picked up the suitcase, and he walked toward the door. Inside, Conrad was already at the kitchen table, laptop open, building the case. The real fight was just beginning. Drake Keener filled a doorway the way certain men did, not through size alone, but through the particular quality of stillness that came from a man holding himself carefully in check. He set his suitcase down in the hallway, looked at the stranger sitting at his daughter's kitchen table, and said nothing for a moment. Conrad stood and extended his hand. Conrad Clarkson. I live across the street. Drake looked at the hand. Then he shook it. Firm, brief. I know who you are, he said. Grace told me. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, the weight of the drive and the phone call and everything in between settling over him all at once. So, what are we doing about this? For the next 20 minutes, Conrad laid it out. He walked Drake through everything. The recording from Tuesday morning, the Walgreens footage, the Crane and Associates connection, the forged complaint filed under Drake's name. He turned the laptop and showed him each piece in order, methodical and unhurried, the same way he had briefed people in rooms far more dangerous than this one. Drake listened without interrupting. His expression didn't change much, just tightened, degree by degree, like something being wound too tight. When Conrad finished, Drake sat back and crossed his arms. We go to the press, he said. Tonight. We take everything you just showed me and we put it in front of a camera and we make it impossible for them to ignore. I understand why you want that, Conrad said. Then let's do it. If we go public right now, Herter has the story by morning. Conrad kept his voice even. Hargrove has a PR firm on retainer. By noon tomorrow, the narrative is that a grieving young widow is making accusations against a decorated officer because she doesn't want to comply with legitimate code enforcement. They will bury this before it breathes. He paused. We have evidence of a pattern. We don't yet have the thread that ties the whole conspiracy together in a way no one can explain away. We go now. We lose. Drake's jaw was tight. My daughter has been targeted in the home I gave her. They used my name. My phone number. He leaned forward. You're asking me to sit on that. I'm asking you to be patient for a few more days, so that when this lands, it lands once, And it lands completely. Conrad held his gaze. Men like Vischer have beaten complaints before. We need this to be the one he can't beat. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Grace placed her hand on her father's arm. Not urgently. Gently. The way you touched someone you knew well enough to know when words would help and when they wouldn't. Drake looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. The particular surrender of a parent who has raised a child capable enough to be trusted. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay." Conrad picked up his phone. He scrolled to a contact he had stored under a single initial, O, and typed a brief, careful message. No details, just enough. Need to talk. Tonight. Secure line. He had made contact with Councilwoman Pia Rushton 2 days earlier through a mutual connection in the state attorney's office, a name passed to him quietly by the federal investigator he had worked alongside 3 years ago. He knew her background. He knew she had been building a case against the Hargrove police relationship for 2 years. He knew she was waiting. The reply came in 4 minutes. A phone number, a time, 11 p.m. At 11 o'clock, Conrad put the call on speaker. Councilwoman Rushton's voice was measured and precise. The voice of a woman who had spent decades choosing her words in rooms that were not always on her side. She listened to the summary without interrupting. When Conrad finished, there was a brief silence. "I've been building toward this for 2 years, she said. "I have circumstantial connections, political patterns, community testimonies. What I don't have is documented, specific, provable misconduct with paper behind it." Another pause. "If what you're describing is as solid as you're telling me, we can take this to my contact at the state attorney's office. But I need the full package. Everything. Nothing partial. Nothing preliminary. They will only move once." "Understood," Conrad said. "Give us a few more days." "You have until the inspection," she said. And the line went quiet. By midnight, the kitchen table had become something else entirely. Conrad assigned roles without ceremony. Drake would formally document the fraudulent complaint filed under his name. Dates, the call record, a written statement. Grace would compile a complete timeline of every Vischer interaction, every violation notice, every witness. Councilwoman Rushton would prepare the legal framework in the background. Conrad would continue surveillance. 6 days until the inspection. Drake looked at the table. The notes, the laptop, the 2 people sitting across from him who were not willing to let his daughter lose what he had spent a lifetime building for her. And something in his face settled. Not calm, exactly. Something more like resolve. "All right," he said. "Let's get to work." Monday morning, Conrad drove to the Maple Crest Police Department alone. He had told Grace and Drake over breakfast that this was a necessary step, not because he believed it would work, but because the record needed to show they had tried. If this case ever went in front of a judge or a federal investigator, the paper trail mattered. Every door they knocked on, every process they followed, every formal channel they attempted and were turned away from, all of it became part of the story. He parked, walked in, and asked for the Internal Affairs Division. The officer at the front desk, young, careful, professionally blank, directed him down a hallway to a small office with a frosted glass window. Conrad sat across from a sergeant named Briggs, laid out a written complaint with precise, documented language, and submitted it with 2 supporting video files transferred to a department-issued USB drive. He was polite. He was specific. He used dates, times, and direct quotes. Briggs accepted the complaint, signed the receipt, and told Conrad he would be contacted when an investigator was assigned. The whole thing took 11 minutes. Conrad drove home knowing exactly what would happen next. The call came at 2:47 that afternoon. A department administrator informed him that his complaint had been received, logged, and assigned to an investigator. The investigator's name was Officer Dominic Denzel. Conrad thanked her, ended the call, and immediately looked up the name. It took him less than 2 minutes. Dominic Denzel, 9-year veteran of the Maple Crest PD. former patrol partner of Sergeant Dylan Vischer. They had worked the same beat, driven the same routes, filed reports side by side from 2011 to 2019. There was a photograph on the department's community outreach page from 4 years ago. Vischer and Denzel at a neighborhood barbecue, both grinning, paper plates in hand. Conrad set the phone down on the kitchen counter. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't even particularly angry. In his experience, systems protected themselves the same way everywhere. Quietly, efficiently, and with the complete confidence that nobody was watching closely enough to notice. He wrote the assignment down in his notes. Date, time, investigator name, prior relationship to subject. Every detail documented. Then he moved on. Grace had spent her lunch break on the phone. She had found the attorney through a bar association referral. A civil rights lawyer based in Atlanta named Pamela Harmon, who had handled 3 municipal misconduct cases in the past 5 years. Grace had prepared for the call the way she prepared for parent-teacher conferences. Notes organized, facts ready, nothing left to memory. Harmon listened carefully and asked sharp, precise questions. Grace answered all of them. When she finished, Harmon was quiet for a moment. Then she said what Grace had been afraid she might say. "The evidence you're describing is strong. Genuinely strong. Under normal circumstances, I would tell you we have a solid foundation for a federal civil rights claim." A pause. "But your inspection is in 6 days. To file for an emergency injunction, I need a minimum of 2 weeks to prepare the motion properly, gather supporting affidavits, and get in front of a federal judge. We don't have 2 weeks. Grace pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose. "Is there anything?" "Not on the injunction timeline. Not responsibly." Harmon's voice was direct but not unkind. "What I can tell you is this. If you can delay or survive that inspection, the case you're describing is exactly the kind of thing I take on pro bono. You get me the full evidence package, I will make time for it." Grace thanked her, ended the call, and sat in her car in the school parking lot for 3 minutes before going back to her classroom. She laid it all out that evening at the kitchen table. She told Conrad and Drake about the complaint assignment, Denzel, the former partner, the 9 years together. Then she told them about the attorney, the timeline problem, the injunction that wasn't coming in time. She kept her voice steady and her language plain. No dramatics. Just the facts. Drake sat with it. He looked at the table for a long moment. Then he picked up Grace's written timeline. 4 pages, handwritten, every Vischer interaction logged in her neat school teacher's hand, and read it from the beginning, page by page, all the way through, without saying a word. When he set it down, his eyes were red at the edges. "You've been carrying all of this alone," he said. Grace looked at her father, at the man who had handed her this house with both hands, and the absolute belief that it would keep her safe, and felt the full weight of the past 6 weeks pressed down for just one moment. "Not anymore," she said. Tuesday was a good day at school. Grace's 3rd graders had been working on a unit about families and history, where people came from, what they carried forward, why it mattered. She had spent the morning listening to 8-year-olds describe their grandparents' houses, their family recipes, the things that got passed down. A boy named Kenny told the class that his great-grandmother still lived in the house where she was born. The class had gone quiet with a kind of instinctive respect that children sometimes showed before they were old enough to know why. Grace had stood at the front of the room and smiled, and felt it move through her like a blade. She got home at 4:30, still carrying the feeling. The brochure was in her mailbox, glossy, full color, folded into thirds like a real estate flyer, like something you'd find at an open house. The front read, Maple Crest Commons, a new vision for community living. Beneath that, a photograph of a sleek modern building against a bright blue sky. Grace stood at the mailbox and looked at it. Then she carried it to the front porch and unfolded it. The inside spread was a bird's-eye rendering of the completed development. She could see the whole thing from above. Clean lines, identical roof lines, a courtyard in the center with ornamental trees that would never grow in this climate. Streets labeled with new names. Green space precisely placed where green space photographed well. She found Camellia Drive. She found it because she knew exactly where to look. The slight curve of the road, the oak trees along the left side, the intersection at the far end. She traced the familiar shape of it with her eyes, the way you traced something you had known your whole life. Her house was not there. Miss Evelyn's house was not there. The two lots sat inside the development's footprint as smoothly as if nothing had ever stood on them. No acknowledgement, no asterisk, just clean, unbroken lines where 30 years of living used to be. She and Miss Evelyn had been removed from the map as completely and casually as you might erase a pencil mark. Grace sat down on the front steps. She sat there for a long time. She thought about her mother kneeling in the dirt of these flower beds on a Saturday morning with her gardening gloves and her old radio playing gospel from the kitchen window. She thought about her father on his hands and knees laying the front walkway, stone by stone, while a 6-year-old Grace handed him pieces from a bucket and felt useful. She thought about Jonas standing on this porch in the early evening light, looking out at the street and saying, "This is your armor, Grace. You understand that?" She looked at the rendering again. Then she folded it carefully, went inside, sat at the kitchen table and graded her papers. All of them. Every page. She wrote her comments in the margins in her neat, deliberate hand. Good thinking, Kenny. Nice work, Aaliyah, because 23 children were coming back to her classroom tomorrow morning, and they deserved a teacher who showed up fully. She did not tell Conrad about the brochure that night. She didn't need to. She already knew what it was. It wasn't information. It was a message. We have already decided. You are already gone. She went to bed early and slept better than she had in weeks. Something had settled in her, something cold and certain that lived on the other side of fear. Wednesday morning, Conrad walked his usual route. He turned east toward the Hargrove site, 2 blocks from Camellia Drive. The cleared land sat open and raw, the topsoil stripped back, a portable site trailer parked along the edge. 2 workers were moving materials near the trailer. Conrad had walked past this spot 11 times in the past 2 weeks. He knew both faces by now. The bigger one, a broad man in his late 40s with a gray work shirt and the permanently tired look of someone who had been doing physical labor since before it was fashionable, was always first to arrive and last to leave. Conrad had heard someone call him Ray. He slowed as he passed, letting Atlas drift toward the grass strip along the trailer's edge. Atlas sniffed the ground with complete disinterest, while Conrad nodded at the man. "Morning," Conrad said easily. "How long has this project been going?" Big Ray looked at him for a moment, then at Atlas, then back at Conrad. "Long enough," he said. The words carried something underneath them, not hostility. Something more like weariness. Like a man who had been watching something he didn't like for a long time and had run out of ways to not see it. Conrad nodded, gave Atlas a light tug, and kept walking. He had gone maybe 30 feet when he heard the footsteps stop behind him. "Hey!" Conrad turned. Big Ray was standing with his back to the trailer, not looking directly at him. His voice was low, careful. "I kept some things," he said. Didn't know why at the time. A pause. "Maybe I did." Conrad held his expression completely neutral. "I know where to find you," he said simply. He turned and walked on. Atlas matched his pace without breaking stride. Conrad kept his eyes forward and said nothing, but his jaw set just slightly. The particular set of a man who has been waiting for the thing that changes everything, and has just heard it arrive. Wednesday evening came in slow and gray. Conrad had spent the afternoon the same way he spent most afternoons, watching, noting, building the map in his head. At 5:15, he texted a single line to the number Big Ray had given him when Conrad circled back to the site an hour after their exchange. 2 blocks north, corner of Elm and 4th. 6 o'clock. He kept it short. Short messages left less to misread. He arrived 5 minutes early and walked Atlas along the block once before settling near the corner. The neighborhood here was quieter than Camellia Drive, a dead-end street, no through traffic, nothing that would make 2 men talking look like anything worth noticing. Big Ray pulled up at 6 on the dot. He was a large man up close, thick through the chest and shoulders, hands that looked like they had been doing real work since before Conrad was born. He moved with the particular caution of someone who had made a decision and wasn't fully at peace with it yet. He looked up and down the block twice before he stopped walking. Atlas sat between them. Big Ray looked at the dog the way most people did, uncertain at first, then reassured by the dog's complete disinterest in him. "Nobody saw me leave," Big Ray said. "Good," Conrad said. "What do you have?" Big Ray reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. His hands were steady, but his jaw was tight. "I've been on this project 7 months," he said. "From the first week, I could see something wasn't right. The timeline was moving too fast for the permits we had. Blocks that weren't supposed to be cleared yet were getting cleared. Houses that were supposed to still have residents. The residents were just gone. You asked about it?" "Once." He looked at Conrad evenly. Once was enough. He opened his email app and handed the phone over. Conrad read slowly and carefully, the way he had been trained to read documents in the field. Not for impression, but for specifics. Dates. Names. Language that was meant to obscure, but didn't quite. The emails were an exchange between 3 parties. Hargrove's regional director, a man named Gabriel Fleck, the inspector from Crane & Associates, and a third address that resolved, when Conrad looked it up, to a private email account registered to Dylan Vischer. The language was careful in places. Corporate. The kind of careful that told you the people writing it knew exactly what they were doing and believed they were smart enough to get away with it. But the meaning was not hidden. Accelerating vacancy on target corridor addresses, a phrase that appeared 3 times across different emails, always in the context of a specific timeline aligned with Hargrove's development schedule. A spreadsheet attached to one email listed addresses on Camellia Drive, with columns marked status. Words like resistant, pending, soft, cleared. Grace's address was listed. The status column beside it read, resistant, accelerate. Another email, from Fleck to the inspector, contained the sentence, coordinate with our contact at MPD to ensure inspection flags are sufficient for abatement on remaining resistant properties. The date on that email was 3 weeks before Vischer's first visit to Camellia Drive. Conrad read it twice. Then he handed the phone back. "How many of these do you have?" he said. 11 emails, screenshots of all of them. Big Ray's voice was quieter now. "I forwarded them to my personal account the day after I tried asking questions and got told to mind my work. I didn't know why I was doing it at the time." He looked down the street. "My grandmother lost her house in a situation like this, back in the 90s. Different city, same story. I watched it happen when I was 12 years old." He paused. "I told myself, if I ever saw it happening again, I wasn't going to be the one who looked away." Conrad looked at him for a moment. "Your family. Do they know you have these?" "No." "Is there anyone at Hargrove who might know you kept copies?" Big Ray thought about it. "I don't think so. I was careful." "You're going to need to stay careful," Conrad said. "Don't talk to anyone at the site about this. Don't change your routine. Don't give anyone a reason to look at you." Big Ray nodded. Conrad photographed all 11 emails on the spot, methodical and thorough. Then he backed everything up to the encrypted cloud server he used for sensitive documentation, a habit so automatic at this point that his hands moved through it before the thought had fully formed. He added a second backup to a server with a different provider. Then a third copy, sent encrypted, to a recipient address only he controlled. Whatever happened next, these emails were not going anywhere. That night, Conrad laid it all out on Grace's kitchen table. He turned the laptop to face her and Drake, and walked them through the emails one by one. The names, the language, the timeline, the spreadsheet with their address marked resistant. He kept his voice even and plain. Just the facts, in order, without editorializing. Drake read the words "accelerate" beside his daughter's address, and went very still. Grace read the email from Fleck to the inspector. Ensure inspection flags are sufficient for abatement on remaining resistant properties. And something behind her eyes went quiet and hard. She reached out and touched the screen, her finger resting just below the date stamp. 3 weeks before he first came to my door, she said. He was already assigned to me. Conrad nodded. He called Councilwoman Rushton's secure line from the kitchen table, put it on speaker, and read her the key passages. There was a silence on the other end that lasted several seconds. Then, "Get me the full package. I'll have my contact at the state attorney on the phone by morning." The kitchen was quiet after the call ended. Drake sat back in his chair. The tightness that had been in his face since Sunday had not gone away, but something had shifted underneath it. Purpose, maybe. The particular forward-leaning feeling of a fight that could actually be won. Grace sat at the table, the same table where she had eaten every important meal of her life, and let herself cry. Not from fear, not from grief, from the very specific, overwhelming relief of someone who has been holding their breath for weeks and has finally been given permission to exhale. Her father reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Thursday had been a good day. That was the part that made it worse. The state attorney's office had confirmed receipt of Councilwoman Rushton's preliminary briefing. The civil rights attorney, Harmon, had called Grace at lunch to say she had reviewed the email chain summary and was clearing her schedule. Conrad had spent the morning running through the full evidence package, the recordings, the photographs, the emails, the documented timeline, and everything was holding. Everything was solid. For the first time since Sunday, the kitchen table felt less like a war room and more like a place where they might actually win something. They had dinner together that evening, the three of them. Drake made his late wife's chicken and rice, the recipe he kept in his head because writing it down had always felt unnecessary. They ate and talked about something other than Vischer for 40 minutes. Grace laughed once, genuinely, fully, at a story her father told about the drive down, and Conrad watched them and said little and seemed content with that. It was the last peaceful moment of the night. Conrad's phone rang at 9:04 p.m. He looked at the screen. Big Ray. He answered immediately. What happened? Big Ray's voice was not the steady, careful voice from Wednesday evening. It was tight and fast and stripped of everything except fear. My truck, he said. Someone broke into my truck last night. My phone is gone. The work phone and my personal one. Both gone. I came home an hour ago and tried to get into my laptop, and it had been wiped. Remotely. Everything on it. Gone. Conrad stood up from the table. Grace and Drake went quiet instantly. Are you at home right now? Yeah, I'm here. Stay there. Don't go back to the site tonight. Don't contact anyone from Hargrove. Conrad kept his voice level and deliberate. Is your family with you? A pause. My wife. My son. Keep them close. I'll be in touch within the hour. He ended the call. The kitchen was completely silent. He told them plainly and quickly. No softening. Big Ray's phone, the phone with the original email screenshots, was gone. The laptop wiped. Someone had moved against their witness, which meant someone at Hargrove, or connected to Hargrove, knew that Big Ray had talked. Drake's chair scraped back. They know what we have. They know someone talked, Conrad said. They don't know about the backups. They don't know what we've already passed to Rushton's contact. He held Drake's gaze. The emails are safe. 3 separate encrypted servers. None of them accessible from anything Big Ray owned. He had backed everything up before showing anyone. The moment Big Ray had handed him that phone on Wednesday, Conrad had treated it the same way he treated intelligence documents in the field. Copy first. Distribute to secure locations. Assume the original will be compromised. It was not caution. It was habit. It was the thing that 17 years of operating in hostile environments had permanently installed in him. They can't take back what's already been sent, Conrad said. The words settled. Drake sat back down slowly. Rushton called 7 minutes later. She didn't wait for a greeting. "There's a story running tonight," she said. "Local outlet. Someone leaked that I've been investigating Hargrove. The piece is framing me as a political opportunist, targeting a development company bringing jobs and investment to Maple Crest." Her voice was controlled but tight. "3 of the 4 council colleagues I need for a formal motion have already gone silent. I've had 2 texts and 1 voicemail since the story posted, all variations of the same message. Let's wait and see." "Does it compromise the state attorney contact?" Conrad asked. "No. That's a separate track, and they don't know about it." A pause. "But it narrows what I can do publicly before the investigation is formally opened." Conrad thanked her and ended the call. He looked at the table. Grace was watching him. Drake was watching him. He started to speak. Then the back door opened, and Drake stepped outside to move his car forward in the driveway. He had mentioned it blocking the sidewalk earlier, and was back inside in under 90 seconds. He stood in the doorway. In his hand was a printed photograph. Grace's house. Full color. Taken from the street. Sharp and clear. Across the front of it, stamped in heavy red ink. Condemned. "All 4 tires," Drake said. His voice was very quiet. "All 4. Grace took the photograph from her father's hand. She looked at it for a long moment. At her house on that piece of paper. At the red words stamped across everything her family had built. And the room around her went absolutely silent, in a way that had nothing to do with sound. She did not shake. She did not cry. She went still in the way Conrad had noticed once before. Not paralysis. Something colder and more deliberate than that. She set the photograph down on the table. "They know where my father parks his car," she said evenly. "They know who's been coming and going. They have been watching this house." She looked up. Her eyes were dry and completely clear. "They are not trying to scare me anymore. They are trying to make me feel like it's already over." She looked at the photograph one more time. "They picked the wrong house." Conrad held her gaze for exactly 1 second. Then he opened his laptop. Drake went to bed at 11. He had held up well. Better than most would have, Conrad thought. But the slashed tires and the photograph had taken something out of him that dinner and determination couldn't fully replace. Grace had walked him to the guest room, come back to the kitchen, and sat down across from Conrad without a word. The house was quiet. Just the 2 of them and the low hum of the refrigerator and Atlas, asleep in the corner with his chin on his paws. Conrad closed his laptop. He looked at her directly, the way he rarely did, the full, unguarded kind of looking that he usually kept rationed, and said, "I need to tell you something about who I am." Grace set down her coffee. "Okay." He didn't frame it dramatically. He never did anything dramatically. "I'm a Navy SEAL," he said. "You knew that part. What you don't know is what I specifically did." He paused, choosing the words the way he chose everything, deliberately, without waste. "For the last 4 years of my service, I ran a 6-man unit. Our job wasn't combat operations. It was intelligence documentation in denied environments." She looked at him steadily. "What does that mean?" "It means we went into places where powerful people were doing corrupt things and believed they were untouchable. Places where anyone who tried to build a case against them had already failed. Our job was to document what was happening in a way that couldn't be dismantled, even when the targets knew someone was watching, even when they were actively trying to destroy the evidence." He looked at her evenly. I have done this in conditions that make Maplecrest look like a Sunday afternoon. The kitchen was very still. The night Big Ray called, Conrad continued, you watched me not panic. I need you to understand why. He turned the laptop back toward her and opened a file. Inside were folders, dated and labeled, each one a layer of the case they had been building. The moment Big Ray showed me those emails on Wednesday evening, I treated that phone as a compromised asset. I backed up every email to an encrypted cloud server before I left the corner of Elm and 4th. Then, a second server, different provider, different country. Then a third copy, sent encrypted to a secure address only I control. He paused. Big Ray's phone is gone. His laptop is wiped. It doesn't matter. I had already moved everything before I walked home. Grace stared at the screen, then at him. You assumed they would come for it, she said. I assumed they would try. They always try. He leaned back slightly. Every conversation of consequence in this kitchen has been recorded on a secondary device. Everything I passed to Councilwoman Rushton went through a channel that isn't traceable to this address. I shared nothing in writing that could be intercepted and used against us. He said it plainly, without self-congratulation. Just facts. I have been running this as an operation from the morning I crossed that street, because that is the only way I know how to do it. Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, show me the rest. Conrad reached down and unclipped the small rectangular device from Atlas's collar. He set it on the table between them. It was barely larger than a matchbook. Matte black, weatherproof, with a wide-angle lens no bigger than a shirt button. Atlas has worn this on every walk since my first week here, Conrad said. It's a military working dog body camera. Standard equipment from my unit. Wide angle, high definition, full audio. He pulled up a folder on the laptop and opened it. Every conversation Vischer has had on Camellia Drive for the past 2 weeks, including the exchange with the Hargrove representative that I was too far away to fully hear, Atlas was within 20 feet of. Ground level. Clean angle. Continuous recording. He played 30 seconds of footage. Vischer's voice filled the quiet kitchen. Clear, unhurried, explicit. The Hargrove representative's response. The document exchanging hands. Every word. Grace watched the screen without moving. When it stopped, she looked at Atlas. The big dog was still asleep in the corner, one ear twitching slightly at the sound of his own recording. His collar lay on the table between them, small and unremarkable, carrying everything they needed. She looked back at Conrad. You were ready for this, she said. Not a question. I was ready for them to try, he said quietly. There's a difference. Grace looked at the folders on the laptop, at the collar on the table, at the man across from her who had crossed a street on a Tuesday morning and quietly, methodically built an architecture of accountability around her house, while she was at school, teaching other people's children. Why? She said. You could have just filed a report, handed over the first recording. You didn't have to do all of this. Conrad was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table, then out the dark window toward Camellia Drive. When he spoke, his voice was low and without performance. I have spent 17 years protecting people in places where the system had already failed them, he said. I know what it looks like when the machinery turns against someone who did nothing wrong. He paused. And I know what it costs when nobody does anything about it. He looked at her. I wasn't going to be the one who looked away. The kitchen held that for a moment. Then Grace nodded once, slow and certain, the nod of someone who has just understood something fully and completely, and reached out and picked up the collar from the table. She turned it over once in her hands, set it back down carefully, like something that deserved to be treated with respect. Okay, she said. What do we do tomorrow? Nobody slept much Thursday night. Conrad had been at the kitchen table until past 2, running through the evidence package one final time, not looking for holes, exactly, but pressure testing it the way he pressure tested everything, asking himself what a good defense attorney would attack first. What a sympathetic journalist could misread. What a compromised investigator might try to dismiss. He had done this in the field with mission plans, sitting in forward operating bases with a headlamp and a satellite phone, finding every weakness before the weakness found them. By 2:30, he was satisfied. By 6, he was dressed and at the table again, with coffee, a legal pad, and a list of names. Grace came downstairs at 6:15. She looked at him, looked at the legal pad, and without a word went to make a second pot of coffee. Drake appeared 20 minutes later. Nobody talked about sleeping. Nobody talked about the photograph. They all understood, without saying it, that last night was last night, and this morning was something else entirely. "Sit down," Conrad said. "Both of you. We have 36 hours. He walked them through it methodically, the legal pad in front of him, each move numbered and sequenced. "Everything has to happen today," he said, "before end of business Friday. Not Saturday. Not Sunday morning. Today. Because we need the legal and federal mechanisms to activate over the weekend so that by Monday morning, when Crane's inspector shows up at this address, he has nowhere to go." He tapped the first item on the list. The evidence package goes to a federal civil rights investigator named Roy Carver. I worked alongside Carver in a DOD capacity 3 years ago. He runs civil rights fraud cases out of the regional federal office. Once this is in his hands, jurisdiction shifts entirely. Herter cannot touch it, Vischer cannot influence it, and Hargrove's attorneys cannot slow walk it through the municipal system. He looked up. Carver agreed to an urgent review when I reached out last night. Drake leaned forward. "You called him last night? After everything that happened?" "After everything that happened," Conrad said, "was exactly the right time to call." He tapped the second item. "Councilwoman Rushton holds a press conference this afternoon. Not the full package. We don't compromise the federal investigation. But enough. The Walgreens footage, the Crane and Associates connection, the fraudulent complaint filed under your name." He looked at Drake. "Public credibility matters. We need the story on record before Monday." He tapped the third. "Harmon files the emergency motion this morning. Inspector conflict of interest. Documented financial ties between Crane and Associates and Hargrove. She needs a federal judge to grant a stay on the inspection." He paused. "She said last night she has a judge in mind. Someone who has seen this kind of case before." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "And what do we do?" Grace asked. "You and Drake stay here," Conrad said. "Close to the phone. I need to be mobile." He left at 8:15 with the full encrypted package on a drive in his jacket pocket, and a duplicate already transmitted to 2 secure servers. He drove to the Federal Building downtown and met Roy Carver in a 4th-floor conference room at 9:30. Carver was a compact, quiet man in his early 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the permanent slight squint of someone who spent his days reading very fine print. He took the drive without ceremony, plugged it into a secure terminal, and read in silence for 22 minutes. When he looked up, he said, "This is a coordinated deprivation of property rights under color of law. Minimum 4 federal statutes, possibly 6. He pulled his glasses down. "I'm opening a preliminary inquiry today." Conrad nodded once. "The inspection is Monday morning. I'll have something in motion before close of business." Councilwoman Rushton's press conference ran at 2 p.m. Conrad watched it on his phone from the parking lot outside the Federal Building. She stood at a podium outside City Hall in a deep blue suit, a single page of notes in front of her, and she was devastating. Calm, specific, and precise. Every sentence a fact. Every fact sourced. She named Crane and Associates. She named the fraudulent complaint. She named the pattern of targeted displacement. She did not name Conrad. She did not name the federal inquiry. She named Vischer. Grace's phone rang at 4:47 p.m. She was standing in the front yard. She had come outside without entirely meaning to, drawn to the porch, then down the steps, then to the flower beds, standing in the same spot, where this had all begun 6 days ago. The evening air had cooled slightly. A few neighbors were out. Camellia Drive looked the way it always looked. She answered on the second ring. It was Harmon. Her voice was even, but there was something alive underneath it. "The judge granted the stay," she said. 30 days. The inspection cannot proceed Monday morning." Grace lowered the phone slowly. She stood in her front yard and looked at her house. The flower beds. The blue door her father had painted the summer she turned 7. The porch where 3 generations of her family had stood watching the same street. And she exhaled. Slowly. Completely. 36 hours. That was all it had taken to dismantle what they had spent months building. She was still standing there when Conrad's green truck turned onto Camellia Drive and pulled into the driveway across the street. He got out and looked at her over the roof of the truck. She held up the phone. He nodded once. That was enough. Nobody suggested sleeping in. By 7 Monday morning, all 3 of them were dressed and downstairs. Drake made coffee without being asked. Grace sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around her mug and said very little. Conrad stood at the front window, watching the street the way he had watched 100 streets before this one. Patiently, with the particular stillness of someone who understood that waiting was not the same as doing nothing. The inspection had been scheduled for 9 a.m. The stay was in place. The inspector had no legal authorization to proceed. On paper, this morning should have been simple. But Conrad had not survived 17 years of operating in dangerous places by trusting that things on paper stayed that way. So they waited. At 8:40 a.m., his phone buzzed. A text from Roy Carver. 2 words. "Moving now." Conrad looked up. It's happening. 2 unmarked federal vehicles pulled up in front of the Maple Crest Police Department at 8:43 a.m. They parked without ceremony. No lights, no announcement. 2 agents in plain clothes walked through the front entrance and asked for Chief Ronald Herter by name. Herter was in his office when they came through the door. He was a large man who had spent 30 years carefully constructing the appearance of authority. The pressed uniform, the commendations on the wall, the particular way he sat behind a desk that suggested the desk existed to hold him up rather than the other way around. He looked at the 2 people standing in his doorway and at the federal credentials in their hands, and something in his face went very still. They handed him a letter. He read it standing up. Then he sat down. The letter outlined the scope of a federal civil rights investigation into a coordinated conspiracy to deprive Maple Crest residents of property rights under color of law. It named Hargrove Development Group. It named Crane and Associates. It named the fraudulent complaint filed under Drake Keener's information. And it named Sergeant Dylan Vischer, who was to be placed on immediate administrative leave, effective that morning, pending the outcome of the federal inquiry. Herter read it twice. Then he made a decision in under 60 seconds. The decision was not complicated. Ronald Herter had built his entire career on one foundational principle: never be the last man standing in a burning building. He had not protected Vischer because he believed in him. He had protected him because Vischer had been useful and the risk had seemed manageable. The risk was no longer manageable. He reached for his phone. He did not call Vischer. He called his department's public affairs office. The Crane and Associates inspector arrived on Camellia Drive at 9:02 a.m. He drove a white company truck with the firm's logo on the door. He turned onto the street slowly, clipboard visible on the passenger seat, moving toward Grace's address with the unhurried confidence of a man arriving to perform a routine task. He got 3 houses down before he saw the unmarked vehicles parked 2 blocks ahead, near the intersection. Federal plates, 2 men in plain clothes standing beside them, making no effort to be inconspicuous. He slowed, looked at the address on his clipboard, looked back at the vehicles. He sat there for 11 seconds. Then he put the truck in reverse, turned around at the nearest driveway, and drove back the way he came. The clipboard stayed on the passenger seat. He did not stop. He did not get out. He did not come back. Grace was on the porch when it happened. She had come outside at 8:50 with her coffee, Drake beside her, both of them watching the street without pretending they were doing anything else. She saw the white truck turn onto Camellia Drive. She recognized the logo on the door. She had looked up Crane and Associates enough times in the past week that the name had embedded itself like a splinter. She watched it slow down. She watched it stop. She watched it turn around. She did not cheer. She did not cry. She stood on her porch and watched that white truck disappear around the corner and felt something move through her that was quieter and deeper than celebration. The particular feeling of a thing that was supposed to happen, that powerful men had spent months engineering to happen, simply not happening, being stopped, being turned back. Her father put his arm around her shoulders. Neither of them spoke. By 10 a.m., Chief Herter's public statement was live on the department's website. Conrad read it aloud from the kitchen table, his voice completely flat. Herter expressed his deep concern over officer conduct. He pledged full and transparent cooperation with the ongoing federal investigation. He described his commitment to the highest standards of integrity within the Maple Crest Police Department. He did not mention Vischer by name. He did not need to. Everyone reading it understood exactly who he was talking about, and exactly how quickly Ronald Herter had decided that 20 years of looking the other way had never happened. Drake listened to the whole thing without expression. When Conrad finished, Drake said, "He didn't even call him first." "No," Conrad said. "He didn't." Drake nodded slowly. The nod of a man who had lived long enough to recognize a coward performing loyalty he never once possessed. Outside, Camellia Drive sat quiet in the morning light. Vischer's cruiser did not appear. For the first time in 6 weeks, the street was just a street. Tuesday morning arrived like a different world. Grace sat at the kitchen table with her phone and watched the regional news app refresh with the particular surreal feeling of seeing something private become suddenly, completely public. Councilwoman Rushton's press conference footage was everywhere. Local news sites, regional affiliates, 3 different social media platforms. The story had grown legs overnight. By 7 a.m., it had been picked up by 2 statewide outlets. By 8, a national civil rights organization had issued a statement of support. Drake sat across from her, reading quietly. Conrad stood at the counter with coffee, watching his own phone. None of them said much. There was a particular kind of silence that came after a long fight started turning. Not celebration exactly. More like the careful, almost disbelieving act of watching something you had worked for become real. Gabriel Fleck, Hargrove Development Group's regional director, resigned at 11:47 Tuesday morning. The company released a statement through their PR firm. Carefully worded, heavy with phrases like, "does not reflect our values," and committed to ethical business practices, that managed to throw Fleck completely under the bus, while mentioning Hargrove's community investment record 4 times in 6 paragraphs. Conrad read it, set his phone down, and said nothing. Grace read it and felt something crystallize in her chest. The cold, clarifying recognition of watching people who had operated with total impunity suddenly move very fast to protect themselves. Hargrove's stock dropped before noon. Investors did not wait for details. The word federal in a press release had a way of making money move. By Tuesday afternoon, the city had formally terminated Crane and Associates' municipal subcontract, pending review of the firm's practices. The inspector who had turned his truck around on Camellia Drive Monday morning, whose name was now in 3 separate news stories, found his professional licenses flagged for review by the state licensing board. He had not spoken publicly. His attorney had issued a brief statement advising that he was cooperating with investigators. Big Ray's attorney, arranged through the civil rights firm, confirmed that afternoon that his client was under formal witness protection protocols and that any attempt at retaliation would be added to the federal complaint. Then the detail emerged that changed the temperature of everything. It came through Carver's office, passed to Councilwoman Rushton, who called Grace directly at 2 p.m. During the execution of a federal search warrant on Vischer's department records, investigators had found a document. A list. Handwritten on standard notebook paper, folded into his desk drawer beneath a departmental manual. It contained the names and addresses of 14 homeowners on the Hargrove Development Corridor. Beside each name, Vischer had written a brief assessment. Notes on age, household composition, employment, whether the owner had legal representation, whether they had family nearby. The list was a targeting document, a vulnerability map. Each person on it had been selected because Vischer had determined they were least likely to fight back. Beside Grace's name, in his handwriting, were 7 words: new widow, no legal background, should be easy. Councilwoman Rushton read it to her over the phone. Grace sat very still at the kitchen table and let those 7 words settle over her. She thought about the first morning Vischer had come to her door, how he had looked at her, how he had calculated the angle of his approach before he ever opened his mouth. He had not arrived at her house as a police officer responding to a complaint. He had arrived as a predator who had done his homework. She had been a name on a list, a vulnerability score, an asset to be acquired. She looked at her father across the table. He had heard it too. She had put the call on speaker without thinking. Drake's face was absolutely still. He was looking at the table and breathing very carefully. "Dad," she said quietly. He shook his head once, not dismissing her, just needing a moment. By Wednesday morning, the story had been running for 36 hours and showed no signs of slowing. Miss Evelyn called at 7 a.m. Her son had been on the phone with an attorney since Monday evening. The sale contract on her house had not yet closed, and with the Hargrove investigation now federal, the attorney had moved successfully to freeze the transaction. Miss Evelyn's house was not gone. Not yet. Maybe not at all. The civil rights firm called Grace at 8. They were taking all Camellia Drive displacement cases on contingency. Every homeowner who had been targeted. Every fraudulent complaint. Every manufactured inspection. All of it. She walked into her classroom at 8:40. She had not told her students anything. She had not told their parents anything. She was their teacher. Whatever was happening on Camellia Drive stayed on Camellia Drive. The principal met her at the classroom door. "The parents have been talking," he said simply. He looked at her with an expression that sat somewhere between pride and apology. Sorry she'd had to go through it. Proud of how she had. "I hope this is all right." He opened the classroom door. Every member of the school staff who was not currently with students was standing inside the room. The principal began to clap. The staff joined him. 23 third graders, who did not fully understand what they were clapping for, but understood that their teacher had done something that mattered, clapped loudest of all. Grace stood at the front of her classroom. She did not hold it together. She did not try very hard to. Kenny, the boy who had told the class about his great-grandmother's house, looked up at her from the front row with the straightforward sincerity of an 8-year-old and said, "Are you okay, Ms. Keener?" She laughed and wiped her eyes and told him she was better than okay. She meant it completely. 3 weeks later, the mornings were different. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would be obvious to someone passing through. The street looked the same. The oak trees, the sidewalks, the modest, well-kept houses sitting in the early September light. But the quality of the quiet had changed. It was no longer the quiet of people holding their breath. It was the quiet of people who had exhaled. Miss Evelyn was on her porch by 7 most mornings now, coffee in hand, watching the neighborhood the way she had watched it for 30 years before fear had driven her inside. Her son had made 3 phone calls and a same-day drive from Birmingham the week after the federal inquiry opened, and the sale contract, not yet closed, still sitting in escrow, had been rescinded. The house was hers. It had always been hers. Now the paperwork reflected that again. 2 doors down, the Hargrove brochure that had appeared in mailboxes up and down the street had been replaced, in several windows, with small hand-lettered signs. Some said, "Not for sale." One, in Miss Evelyn's front window, said simply, "We are still here." Grace saw the green truck before she heard anything. She was at the kitchen window with her coffee, a Saturday habit, unhurried, no alarm, no lesson plans, when she noticed Conrad's front door open. He came out carrying a box, set it in the truck bed, went back inside, came out with another. She set her mug down. She had known this was coming. His shoulder was healed, had been healed for 2 weeks, if she was being honest about what she'd observed. He had mentioned Virginia once, briefly, in a conversation about what came next. She had not asked him to elaborate, and he had not offered. Some things didn't need to be mapped out ahead of time. She went to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a moment. Then she opened the cabinet above the stove and took down her mother's recipe box. The sweet potato pie had been her mother's signature, the dish she made for every occasion that mattered, the one she had never written down, because, she said, written-down recipes were for people who didn't trust their own hands. Grace had learned it by standing beside her at this stove and watching and asking questions and being told to just feel when it was right. She had made it twice since her mother passed. Once for her father's birthday. Once for Jonas, the first Thanksgiving they spent in this house together. He had eaten 2 slices and declared it the finest thing he had ever tasted, which she knew was not entirely objective, but loved him for anyway. She had not made it for anyone outside family. Until now. The truck was 3/4 loaded when she crossed the street. She carried the pie in both hands, still warm, covered with a dish towel the way her mother had always covered it. Conrad was at the tailgate, adjusting a bag, when he heard her footsteps, and turned. He looked at the dish in her hands, then at her face. She held it out. He took it carefully. The way you took something you understood was not a casual gift. "You didn't have to," he said. "My mother made this for people who mattered," Grace said. "So." Conrad looked at the pie for a moment. Something moved across his face, quiet and unguarded. The closest thing to unguarded she had ever seen from him. Atlas appeared from behind the truck and sat between them, ears forward, looking up at the dish with professional interest. "That's not for you," Conrad told him. Grace laughed. It came out easy and full and real, and she realized it was the first time she had laughed on this driveway in a very long time. She looked at him steadily. "My mother used to say that a house is just wood and brick until people love it into something real." She glanced back at Camellia Drive, at the flower beds, the blue front door, Miss Evelyn raising her coffee cup from the porch next door in a small, unhurried salute. "I used to think that was just something Mom said." She looked back at Conrad. "Thank you for seeing what it was worth." Conrad held her gaze. He didn't deflect it, didn't minimize it, didn't reach for a modest answer. He simply received it, the way a man received something he had genuinely earned and knew it. "Take care of it," he said quietly. "Always have," she said. He loaded Atlas into the passenger seat. The big dog settled immediately, chin dropping toward the window, ears relaxed for the first time in weeks. Conrad closed the door and stood beside the truck for a moment, his hand resting on the roof, looking across at the house on Camellia Drive. Still standing? Flowers still in the beds. The blue front door catching the early morning light the way it had caught it every morning for 30 years. He nodded once. Then he got in, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. Atlas barked once as the truck reached the end of the street, sharp, clean, proud. And then they turned the corner and were gone. Grace stood in her driveway and watched until there was nothing left to watch. The street settled back into its Saturday morning quiet around her. A sprinkler ticked somewhere. A child on a bicycle wobbled past the oak trees. Miss Evelyn raised her coffee cup again from the porch next door, and Grace raised an invisible one back. She turned and looked at her house. The walkway her father had laid stone by stone. The flowers her mother had tended for 20 years. The porch where Jonas had stood in the evening light and called this place her armor. All of it still here. all of it still standing, all of it still hers. She walked up the front path, pushed open the blue door, and went inside. Justice, when it finally comes, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it crosses the street, asks if you're ready, and stays until the work is done. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.